course, the company's values at the beginning are the founder's values. But once you're in a scale up, then you have a different job to be done to the company. Things are constantly changing. Something you tried last week might not be the same this week anymore. I cannot be everywhere on one side. And if I am everywhere, then I'm not allowing the team members to be their full potential in that area. As you grow as a team, there's more work for you to be done as a CEO, as a founder. You need to find sort of that perfect balance between efficiency and effectiveness.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Behind the CEO's Door. Today, the first international version with Fabian Bollhalder, 30 under 30, 2x founder. And he's going to introduce what the company was that he founded in a second to us and what it's about. Please, Fabian, what are you doing and what does your company do?
Hi, Matthias. Thank you for inviting me. So quickly to MyBikePlan and MyHomePlan. What we do is we are an e-commerce company where we sell high-ticket items with a 0% financing. So this means instead of having to pay 5 to 6 to 7,000 francs for an e-bike, you can do that between 12 to 48 months with a 0% financing. So it can start anywhere at around 52 francs a month. The exact same thing with furniture. So instead of paying 4,000 francs for a sofa, you can do the same thing at 6 to 36 monthly rates at 0% financing. So meaning at around 42 francs a month, you can buy a sofa. Currently, we are around 15 employees. We've never done any fundraising, so we're completely bootstrapped. We've just launched MyHomePlan, but we're in the fourth year, just closing the fourth year of MyBikePlan, going into the fifth year of MyBikePlan, and are at revenue right now just below 10 million. Next year, we should be able to jump over that quite nicely.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So as we have now briefly covered the business part, as usually, podcast focus very much on these parts. I have introduced it to you already in the previous conversation. We are going to talk about you as a founder, you as a CEO today. We're going to leave the business not completely, but as much as possible behind. Cool. So let's jump right into it. You have, if I look at your CV, have had a very interesting career before you started founding. You have been in different countries. One of the ways that you market your company has been, you have been experiencing the pain of moving yourself and finding new furniture, finding furniture that you might have to throw away. And the idea behind your company, as far as I've seen, was that you want to reduce, so you want to have less products bought because that improves the environment. Less products bought means less waste and a longer durability of the products itself, right? So
correct.
Perfect. So as you have been beginning your trip, I've seen in Asia, you have seen multiple different countries, you have seen multiple different cultures. How did you start off with that? Why did you go so far away, and what was the experiences that have formed you out of that, I would say?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I would say most of the things in my childhood were quite unique in that sense. They weren't chosen by me; they were given to me. So this opportunity was really given to me in that sense. As my father, he was in the hotel industry, and so with that, we sort of moved around every 2-3 years. So he went to go manage in a hotel, and with that, of course, the whole family moved around. And of course, what that allowed us to do as kids was to constantly see new cultures, new environments, new friends, because every 2-3 years you sort of have to make new friends, see new people, be in a different schooling system. So that was quite nice for us as kids. And of course, we always had that in the comfort bubble because, of course, we were sort of in an international school. That means we had, the understanding of how the structure can work. It wasn't that we had to go to a local school in China or a local school in Azerbaijan. We had sort of this comfort zone outside of the comfort zone. But yeah, I would say definitely these things are what sort of shaped me to be who I am today. The fact that I just moved around the world my whole life and actually only moved to Switzerland when I was around 21, even though I'm fully Swiss in my blood in that sense.
Right. So what you have already mentioned, you were only in places 2 to 3 years. Most probably one of the challenging things will have been the social environment because that changes. Friends in this age is not so easy. It's easier to pick up friends, but it's not so easy to leave them behind. So what was the most challenging thing? Maybe that was it, but apart from that, maybe as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think for me that wasn't even a challenging thing. I quite liked moving around. I mean, I was in Beijing for 6 years, and I remember telling my parents like, "Hey guys, when are we moving again? I'm bored." You know, and to be bored of the biggest city in the world is pretty hard to be in that sense. So you know, the interesting thing was that every time we moved to a place, we kind of knew, hey, we're only going to be here for a certain time. So of course, I made really good friends, really good connections, but the understanding was also there that, hey, either that friend might move away sometime soon, or either I might move away sometime soon. So that wasn't really too much of a challenge. I think that sort of for me that was quite a benefit. I quite enjoyed it, and that also made me now very easy to sort of make new friends and all these things. I would say the hardest thing, um, I don't know if there was a hard thing. I enjoyed it. I loved it.
I'm pretty sure there was a hard thing if you dig a bit deeper.
Probably,
Uh,
yeah,
we're
probably.
gonna come to that for sure. So, what, on the other hand, maybe were the advantages that you would say you gained through that experiences that otherwise you would have not if you would have grown up in Switzerland and would have had a regular
Hmm.
experience of growing up?
Yeah. I mean, I often reflect on this, and I think one of the biggest things is, um, I'm sure you might have felt it, or other people might have felt it, is that when you are in a certain environment with specific people, you sort of have that profile within that team or within that community. And I think the biggest benefit that I had was the fact that because I constantly moved around, I sort of was always able to reshape myself a little bit, right? So it's not saying that I wanted to reshape myself and be sort of a shapeshifter, but just what that allowed me to see is sort of to see, okay, hey, what does it feel like to be a different person, or kind of from a different angle within a social group.
Hmm.
So I think that was one of the biggest things, really, to see like, okay, hey, when I lived in Beijing, I was more like this person. When I've lived in Hong Kong, I was more, you know, this kind of guy. When I was living in Indonesia, it was more focused around this, and I think that has brought me quite or into today as well, because I'm able to see the perspective from a lot of different people, because I've been in different perspectives into social groups. I think that's sort of the biggest benefit that I'm currently reflecting on. At least I guess it constantly changes a bit depending on where I'm currently reflecting.
Perfect. Since you're currently reflecting on it, how would you say was that shape shifting, to pick up the way you described it? So could you maybe describe the phases that you were going through and the thoughts behind that, why you would shift, since not many people have this opportunity. So what did you experience there? How did you change yourself, and what was the reflection on it?
But yeah. I mean, I think you know, like when I was in Beijing, it was sort of I was from 8 years old to around 14 years old. So of course, every age gap, you sort of have a different thing that you're building right now. So Beijing, I would say, was very much sort of like discovery phase. Um, a lot of like team sports, a very American system. So being in the American system, and just being in sort of this normal structure. And I think Hong Kong was then very different, because in Hong Kong there was quite a lot more freedom to me, because living in a big city, not having to take the school bus every day, so sort of really discovering the city, having a very different friend group as well. And so there it was very much more based on my learnings of who I was in Beijing. In Hong Kong, I would say, you know, I sort of went definitely a lot into the party scene. But at the same time, whenever I was there, I was always very interested in business still, because of what I had already done in Beijing. And so yeah, I think it's kind of hard for me to say exactly which persona I was in different places, because again, it's not like I was shape shifting and being a new person every single time. I would just say it was kind of I was developing as a person, especially in my age, in different areas.
Hmm.
So that gave me a big learning depending on where I was. And I would say I'm super grateful that I also grew up in Hong Kong, like my prime ages, because of course, you know, living in Hong Kong is very different than living in Beijing when you're 14 to 18, and having different freedoms around you.
So what
That's for
what
sure.
would you say is different in Hong Kong to Beijing to Zurich maybe?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I would say one of the personal biggest differences was whenever I was growing up, I was always a third culture kid, and always living in a country that was not Western like I was experiencing in my culture that I was watching on TV, right? So through our cultural learnings, we were used to a lot of like just simple things like specific candy brands, the fact that we could play Xbox Live. In China, we couldn't do any of that. It was all blocked. You didn't have the candies. You didn't have any of these things that was just normal on TV, and we were still in sort of the American system. When I moved to Hong Kong, Hong Kong was sort of the first country or city, however you see it, was the first place that I actually that people were living there. They grew up there their whole life, and they didn't feel like expats, but instead they felt like they actually belonged there and actually were from there. And because of that, you actually see there's so many more opportunities. People live 20, 30 years in Hong Kong, which they never do in, Beijing, Jakarta, anything like that. And so I think, that was my biggest thing. When I moved to Hong Kong, it was like, oh, wow, this is a home where you can settle. It's not just a place that you're going to go from one step to the next.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. I've heard that many times about Hong Kong, especially that it feels like the cities of the foreigners, and who make it their home. So
Yeah, definitely.
So what happened since you have been in Asia a considerable long time of your very young life in this case? What happened then? You decided to come back. Did that have any reason? Were you getting homesick at some point to say, I want to see that part of my heritage as well? What happened?
No, so I think this is also, the very much sort of culture, what was normal. It was normal that, okay, you might study in Beijing or in Hong Kong, but once you want to go to university, you're going to go to either the UK, to the US, to Australia, or back home to Switzerland for me, right? And so I think it was quite the natural step. There wasn't really a question like, hey, am I going to stay in Hong Kong now and study? I was looking at universities in Australia, in the UK. And then in the end, I actually decided to go to the UK, where I studied industrial design. So it wasn't, and that was really a very simple reason, because when I was growing up in China, I really got into this entrepreneurial flair. I was wheeling, dealing, I was buying things, selling them. I was, I was buying like, I remember in China, I had like a 3-wheel bicycle. And so while everyone had like rugby practice, I would take this bicycle, I would go to the shop, buy massive gallons of water and sell that to them while they had their break. So like I was just doing these things while everyone's doing like rugby practice. And so for me, it was just, I knew I wanted to do business, and my entrance into that was design. So I chose industrial design, and then I went to the UK to study that. And then after 2 years in the UK, I saw, okay, it's not exactly the right course for me. It's not exactly the right location, even though I loved it. It wasn't the right place for me. And that's why I actually moved then to Switzerland for the first time. So it was kind of a natural thing, and then with a bit of changing of decisions midway.
Makes sense. So as you have now said that you came from the business side, you wanted to do business, you wanted something other than playing rugby. In the meanwhile, you did other things. I believe the experience you had in this case might be something more unique to Asia than you would experience it in Europe in the same way. You wanted to say something?
No, all good.
All right. So what would you say is different in terms of business, what you have experienced in your passages, compared to the business, how you experience it today?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I never did proper business in China, right? I mean, I was just a kid sort of trying to make some money with some different things. The only time I really started businesses was after university in Switzerland. So when I finished my course, I said to myself, like, hey, Fabian, just take at least 1 year now and just do something. Because during uni, I kept trying to do projects. I kept, making the business model canvas, building the brand, trying different things. And I never got that step further. So I just told myself, hey, take 1 year to do something and see how it gets. And so my first sort of business experience, my official business experience, really started in Switzerland and not sort of in China in that sense. There it was just more inspiration and sort of the surrounding of the environment that really made my character, I guess, really want to get into that.
Right. So now that you have become a leader, we have talked about many influences and where they come from. Now you have become a leader. You said yourself you are leading a company of 16 people now, I think. And it's basically your first real business experience. How did that come upon, and how did that start?
Yeah. So So I mean, I had so I said after that uni or after uni, I did a project that sort of got a little bit of funding. We built a tiny team. I mean, it was three co-founders with one developer. So we did that for around a year and a half. That was my first formal experience. But there we were very much still had not found product market fit. And we sort of closed down before finding product market fit. So of course, a very different setup than what I have now, because as a founder, then you don't really care about any of these organizational topics or anything like that. It's just really investing all your time in finding product market fit. And after that, you can build everything around it. And then after that, I had gone worked at two companies, so Tesla and Govago. So there I learned also quite a bit in terms of sales process, psychology of sales, and also how to set up a team, how to set up team structures, meetings, all of these things. And then my bike plan was sort of the first formal structure that I led, and also had to build it myself.
Right.
Right. So I guess the question would be where do you want to target at?
Right. So I would be really interested, and I think our viewers in this case as well. From that moment on that you started your business, you were coming from also a corporate background, as you mentioned, Tesla, for example, which I believe has definitely best-in-class sales techniques and that are very useful. But since your company is not built as a Tesla and you don't have 100,000 employees sitting there, the structures will be vastly different. What was the experience that you've made once implementing certain things that you have learned before? Most probably also came upon certain obstacles and surprises that you would have not expected. What was in there?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the biggest things was that my bike plan was started as sort of a side hustle, right? So I had a job, I was doing this on the side. So there was my biggest learnings as well from the first company that, hey, to go all into something until you know that it really works doesn't really make sense. So I was working on the side, building my bike plan. We had initial revenue in the first year. We had our first employee, so an intern in the first year, and at that point it was really a side hustle. I classified it as a side hustle. And then after 1 year of doing that, then it made sense. Hey, all the risks were covered. Hey, we know this will work. I know I will be able to pay myself a little bit, and it's sort of the transitioning then from a side hustle to a startup. So we got an office space, a garage. We had then two more team members joining us. And then it sort of organically grew, right? So then we were sort of in startup phase. We had to just keep building what we had built, figuring out still what our product was. Is it exactly that what we had just then? Is that going to branch out? What's our strategy going to be? Is it going to be geographic expansion? Is it going to be product expansion? Is it going to be placement expansion? All these different things. So very startup style. And we did that, I would really say, in that same garage from around the three of us, sorry, all the way to around 10 people. And then after that, we sort of moved a bit more into scale up phase. And our metaphor is always our office, because we moved them from that garage to a bit more of a formal office, a bit of a prettier office, and it really then moved from a startup into a scale up. And of course, at every one of those transitions, there's a very different sort of leadership aspect in that sense, right? And of course, the whole structure of how we work together, how we communicate with each other, it actually grew very organically with that, right? So of course we had our basic communication setups already from the beginning. So we had our Slacks, we had our different channels for our different groups. That's how we communicated through there. We had, so we had our stand-ups. So every single day we would do our stand-ups, and at the beginning, of course, it was everyone.
Right.
And then the bigger we grew, there was a phase when we could finally call it departments. I mean, we're still only 15 people, but we still now have a product team, we have a marketing team, we have a sales team. And so organically, with new joiners, we're able to sort of change the structure a bit. Like, hey, okay, now not the whole company needs to do a stand-up, but now the whole company does a meeting once a week, whilst the marketing team does it every day, while the sales team does it every day. And then it really becomes a bit more about organizational design, about communication within the departments, because of course there still needs to be a knowledge trade-off between everyone, but you don't need to be with each other every time, because you need to find sort of that perfect balance between efficiency and effectiveness, right? And of course, for everyone to listen to everyone on what they do makes absolutely no sense, because most times salespeople have no idea what developers are talking about, and vice versa. But at the same time, as a developer should know what the sales targets, how we're performing, right? Because in the end, everything they're developing has an impact on
Right.
that. So that was quite an interesting transition throughout sort of those 3 phases. And we're not out of startup phase. We're definitely still in startup, especially when we look at now My Home Plan. That is a pure startup thing. Whilst My Bike Plan, we're trying to scale, right? So it's so even within there now, we have to see how do we communicate about My Home Plan versus My Bike Plan.
Right.
So a lot of different transitions which happen very organically based on our developments as a company.
Right. So you have described that already. There is a transition now between a startup and the scale-up phase, right? We all know that businesses run through certain organizational things and communication things that you have mentioned already. And you also brought up already the topic of leadership. What would you say defines the phases between your startup phase? So you have another company now in a startup phase, and you have one company in a scale-up phase. How do they differentiate in terms of leadership, and how do you have to treat them differently, or do you does it put you in different difficulties? Most probably, yes.
No. So I think the most interesting thing was, especially coming as a designer, or as entering the business world from a design background. For me, everything was always, we can solve everything with creativity. And I looked at things very different than someone who had done an MBA or a finance background and entered a company, for sure. And I think one of the biggest transitions is also how me as a CEO and a founder, what my job to be done is, right? So I think that's super important to constantly evaluate what your job is to be done towards the company, And at the beginning, when it's just a side hustle or just a startup, again, it's just about proving product market fit. It doesn't matter anything else, because everything else is just wasted space. But once you're in a scale up, then you have a different job to be done to the company, right? Maybe it's to find funding, it's to bring the vision further, it's to bring more partners in. So it's super important, I think, and this is why I realized to constantly reflect yourself and say, what is your job to be done to the company?
So how do you do that?
And
So how do you do that? Like, do you sit every once in a week and say, okay, who am I? Who do I need to be next week? Or does that happen once a month? Or how?
No.
How does that take place?
I mean, I think this happens organically, right? I think this is something you're sort of developing through the company, and day by day, week by week, you realize, hey, we need to optimize, we need to test this. And I mean, as long as you're constantly in optimization and testing mindset, you will automatically think about these things,
but
right?
Isn't that a bit contrary to each other in terms of, if you think about the organization, you're not thinking about yourself in terms of what do I need to maybe learn, what do I need to achieve or attain for myself as a skill set. In order to be able to overcome the next challenge, right? Because you're always thinking in advance. In the moment that you are, the skill sets that you have today are not going to help you solve the challenges of tomorrow. This famous sentence. In this case, you said it's very organically, but I guess it has to be happening on a repetitive and a quite frequent pace, because otherwise you will not be able to catch when you actually need to improve on something or you need to change something.
Yeah. And I think, as a startup, that's what they always say about a startup. It's super fast paced. Things are constantly changing. Something you tried last week might not be the same this week anymore. Something you implemented last week might be completely useless this week. So I think that's sort of that organic, as long as you're constantly testing new ideas, testing new mindsets. So on one side, very practically said now towards like, the meeting structure, they're having the weeklies. We tested, always different methods. How should we have the weeklies now? Should it be everyone talking once? Should it just be departments heads talking once? Should it just be me talking once? So we were testing those things, and then of course on a personal note, at the beginning, as a founder and as a CEO, you want to be everywhere, but then you also realize, hey, I cannot be everywhere on one side, and if I am everywhere, then I'm not allowing the team members to be their full potential in that area, and vice versa, because if they constantly come to you, you cannot do what you have to do for the company, right? And I think that was my biggest realization, is that, hey, I have a job for the company, and the more I'm doing other people's or looking at other people's things, the less I can do my job that the company needs of me now.
So how did you solve that challenge?
That was one of my biggest. So there was a few things, to be honest, some very practical. I mean, as we grew organically, that means, of course, the larger we got, the more sort of head ofs we could get into the structure. So it means also a bit more seniority into the team, and then sort of saying, sort of really having to make a clear cut who is responsible for what now. So if at the beginning, if everyone came to me for a certain topic, but of course now there's a head of that should be taking that on, you know, then it's very important that whenever those questions come to you, you automatically redirect them, saying like, hey, that's not me anymore. I'm not responsible for that. I don't know, or I can't help you with that. But, this and this person can. I think that's one very important spot. The second one that I noticed was physical distance. In our old office, we were all sort of sitting on top of each other. You could talk to anybody. In our new office, we had a bit of space. And what that allowed is actually to say, hey, to put sort of a head of in between me and the other team. So that means they literally had to go to that person before they came to me to ask a question. And that naturally, of course, gave them the blocker of going to me because it goes to them. And so I think there's a few like practical things that you can do. And I think it's about consistency as well, right? In that transitioning period.
Right. Of course, it's about consistency, especially when we are talking about leadership, because it normally is lived and not just told about. And that's when we normally come to the phrase leadership, or to the term leadership embodiment, right? Where rather than telling how we want to lead or what our ideals are, we are actually showcasing them every day by how we act, how we do. How would you describe the embodiment of your leadership? What defines your type of style?
Yeah, so I mean, leading by example, I guess, in that sense. I think that is the most important thing. I think it's also a constantly evolution of understanding like, hey, what is the values of our team, right? And at the beginning, it was a bit confusing because I had personal values, how I like to work, and I was wondering, hey, is that the team's values or not? And then I also came to realize, hey, of course, the company's values at the beginning are the founder's values. The way that I work and think, that's obviously going to be the values of the company, because at the beginning, I'm the person that hires the people. I'm the person that onboards the people, right? So of course, I get people that match me in a certain way. So I think that was a bit of a realization for me as well, right? That like, hey, the values that I do have, that is what the other people have, and then leading by example on that, right? So I mean, for me, it's working, being at the office on time, being in the office early, getting the things done, just doing the things I promise I will finish. So I mean, classic leading by example sort of things there.
I mean, classic leading of example works for the good as for the bad, right? If I repeat a behavior that I would say influences the productivity and the engagement of my employees negatively, it's also repetition, and it's also having the same effect, usually even faster than something positive that takes a bit longer. Some things that you would rather maybe change if you would have known before that you maybe did unconsciously, and then you said it yourself, you're reflecting on yourself. What is something that you found and that you have changed?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm definitely not perfect as a leader yet, that's for sure. I think it's a constantly learning. It's something you constantly need to learn. I mean, I'm still young. I'm still trying to find my ways in that sense. I think something I would have liked to change a bit earlier in regards to my leadership is probably, I mean, one thing is having an advisor in regards to how to lead. I mean, now, for example, I've joined EO, which is an entrepreneur organization, and there we can, talk to each other. And there often I ask other founders about their leadership styles, and that's sort of how we can exchange. And I think, often I personally have maybe an impulsive reaction to things. And by having an advisor or other people, I've realized that, okay, my impulsiveness sometimes needs to calm down. see it a bit more overarching, and then approach the problem. And I think if I would have had an advisor or something a bit sooner, I think that is maybe a leadership characteristics that I could have solved a bit
Mhm.
earlier. Yeah.
So have you found a mentor now for yourself, or would you say that you have multiple mentors? As you said, you are in a community now. Of course, that can work as well with multiple people that you take as a reference for different topics. So how would you say is your advisorship working now?
Yeah, I mean, now definitely in the company, having a more of an advisor as well, with long-term business experience, that's one thing. The community for sure. I mean, I really recommend anyone, starting out to join a group, and the reality is no one when starting out knows how these things work. So it's a constant learning, and it's the classic thing that everyone says: if you can learn from someone else's failures, then you win a lot of time and a lot of money.
Hmm.
And I think that is 100% the case. So advisors is definitely a huge support, and having a forum or a entrepreneur connection where you can be really open and transparent with each other, and there's no judgment and all these things. So definitely entrepreneur organization is a great thing for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's also one of my learnings now looking back, to do that a bit sooner.
Makes sense. Can you maybe give me an example of one advice that you have gotten that you remember until today, where you say, geez, if somebody would have told me that in the right moment sometime before, that would have saved me a lot of pain.
Yeah, maybe not in regards to leadership, but in terms of business, just general, right? I mean, there was, a huge example that, last year, that if we would have known about this, then we could have saved a lot of pain last year. I don't want to go into details what it is, but I think, there's definitely a few examples there that, more on the business side and on leadership. I mean, small things in leadership as well, when we're, like talking about HR topics, and I say like, hey, this and this happened right now. I would approach this like this, and then an advisor would say to me, okay, but think about the long term of the business. Think about our reputation. Wouldn't you prefer if this was the outcome, and we could look at it, we could approach it like this. But yeah, so I think there's definitely some long term things, and also very small incremental things day to day that helps from an
Right.
advisor.
Makes sense. Now, you have mentioned before that, especially in the phase of transitioning from, let's say, a steering role where you are the best in a certain subject and you have to give that over to somebody else because the company is getting bigger. And as you said, you have to focus on your actual role as a CEO. You have different topics on your table, you have different responsibilities. And then maybe some of the more creative part, you're coming through design, you said. So maybe the more creative part you had to give to somebody else. Was that difficult for you to actually give it away and then give somebody else the responsibility for the results?
Very difficult, very difficult. I mean, I think, also depending on where you come from, where your domain is, if it's something that you don't mind giving up, you can probably do it easier than if it's something that you do believe you can
Hmm.
do. And so there definitely, more on the marketing and design side of things, I had quite a struggle in terms of like, hey, how do I build the organizational structure? How can I, bring in a head of, but then how much do I want to be involved? How much do I need to stay out and give that person the space to do their
Hmm.
job? Right, and to find that fine balance is super difficult.
Right.
Because of course, as a founder and as a CEO, you see a lot of the things that are happening around just one certain domain, and so you might have some pressure that you want to push into there, or you might have some knowledge that you want to push in there. But at the same time, if you do too much of that, you don't allow the person to flourish fully. And so there, there's a big learning as well there. How much you stay in, and how much you sort of allow to sit
Right.
back.
So for you as a person, what would you say hurts the most, taking yourself out of something that you most probably love as well? Once you're coming through that, and once you're becoming good at it, that's something that we normally hold dear. What hurts the most
Hmm.
by giving away something like that? Is it
You
is
mean
it
which
is it
domain,
more
or?
no, is it more the ego that gets hurt because you
Aha.
cannot shine in
Hmm.
something that you already put a lot of effort in, or is it the lack of control or the loss of control in a certain way? Um,
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the ego. I like seeing really awesome
mhm.
results. I like seeing really amazing outcomes. So if someone else can do that, I'm super happy, because then I look at it, I'm like, wow, that's awesome. I think it's more the lack of control, or the not knowledge of what's happening in the background.
Hmm.
Because of course, a lot of people are doing a lot of things in the background, not always saying these things, but whilst when you're doing it yourself, you know exactly every single thing that happened.
Right.
So I mean, an example, not that it is the example, but let's say if it goes towards optimization of ads, if you do that yourself, you see exactly everything. Whilst if you give that to someone else, you don't know that, but there's a lot of work in the background that's happening that you just don't see.
So how did you build that
And so I think it's
trust in order to be able to be sure that what happens in the background is also what you would like to happen in the background?
Yeah, I think this is also similar to sort of those transitions, right? Transitioning as an organizational structure from sort of side hustle to startup to scale up. When we did that, we got much better in terms of documenting our meetings, documenting our information, how that we work as a team. So that means, every meeting we do now, we document, we have the comments there, so anytime anyone wants to see something, they can go in and see it. Right. So we have one big confluence now for the whole company. We have a marketing, a tech, a sales, and you can go in and see all the meeting notes. And I think this is again a tool, an actual tool that allowed me to understand what is happening, to build communication between specific people. So things like this are super important. And again, we didn't do this when we were in that
Of course.
garage. Then we just had everything everywhere. We didn't even have a Google Drive with everything centralized. So of course, bringing those sort of things early into your company helps saves you quite a lot, to have that better feeling, I guess.
Makes sense. So you overcame the bridge of trust by with organizational topics, by having the reports afterwards and knowing, okay, these metrics are good, and therefore I can trust what you're doing is good.
Yeah, yeah, and I think trust comes from communication. I think communication is the ultimate thing in a company, because communication is the only way I can know what you've done. Communication is the only way I can know the output that you've performed. And so I think it's always more important to have double communication than to have too little communication. And I think as long as you can over communicate, communicate the right things, and communicate that maybe in a presentation, on a Slack channel, and in a personal one-to-one conversation, then it's 100% guaranteed that that person knows exactly what's happening. And I think as long as you have that, that's how you can function as a group.
Right. I would maybe add a little word to that communication, because communication is so broad and not all communication is good communication. But in this case, open communication, right? Honest communication. When you are behind a deadline and you communicate it, somebody else can react to it. If you don't communicate it, this is what actually harms the process itself, and nobody knows until it's too late. So maybe to have this openness, if you're
Exactly.
able to establish
I
that.
mean, I would say that goes into feedback culture, right? And to say so one of our values now is straight communication, because we say, hey, look, if you have a problem, or if there's something wrong, straight
Okay.
communication. And because it's a value of ours, we know that it's acceptable to
Hmm.
give it, and we know it's acceptable to receive it. And when we receive it, we don't see it as a negative thing, because hey, it's straight communication. And by having that straight communication within our values, we actually can give feedback at the right time, not hold grudges, close those problems or issues, or close
Hmm.
dilemmas, and really move forward and stay always as a group and move forward to the overall
Is
goal.
that something that you had to establish later on once the company grew? Or is that something that you implemented at the very beginning to say, okay, guys, if there is something that you disagree with, you always come to me and tell me to the face, because I don't want anybody talking behind my back? Or how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of the balance again. So sort of that is one of my values anyways. Then, sort of within a bit of the transitioning, we had a bit of a workshop where we figure out what everyone's values is, how we think we work, then sort of highlight the major values. We did a team workshop. We got an external guy to come help us. And then we took that and just constantly developed. So it's never something that, is cemented and you can never
Of
change it.
course.
It's something that changes as well. But in the end, it kind of links back to the original values. I mean, I'm a very direct person. I am very straight up communication. And that is now within the team, that is lived and breathed as well within
Of
the team.
course. So maybe what I've seen that a couple of times now. I think also Netflix has implemented the culture of, they call it brutal honesty. where basically
Yeah.
the cleaning lady can go to the CEO and tell them about what structurally is not going right, of course, respectfully, but straight to the face and without covering anything. Is that the kind of honesty that you would describe in your company as well?
Yeah, and I mean, again, we're not perfect. I mean, and I think that's one of the biggest things as well. I'm constantly absorbing knowledge. So the Netflix book, that's exactly where I also get inspiration, and that's what I'm also trying to implement. So I'm constantly out there listening to podcasts, listening to books, reading books, and then I'm trying to pinpoint, okay, what matches us, what can we use, what can support us, what can grow us, and I'm trying to then bring that back into the company. So exactly from that example, that's something I read there, and I said, okay, this is something we kind of do, but it needs to be put as a value. So it's very open and transparent. So it's clear, and I mean, also the example of Tesla, there was a very simple rule. If you're in a meeting and you bring zero value, you can stand up and leave that meeting and there's no hard feelings, because normally in a corporate, it's like, oh, that's super rude. Why is that guy just leaving? Whilst in Tesla, it's like more like, why are you even here? You don't need to be here. Right. And so I think it's just a constantly evolving thing. And of course, the more years you are in business, the more they solidify. But you always have sort of some agility and breathing room there.
Right. Was there any side effects that came in? The bigger the company grows, the more people you have to tell their opinion, the bigger the potential for friction and for any kind of critical happenings. Was there anything that you experienced in
Yeah.
terms of that?
I mean, I think that was also one of my biggest learnings, right? As you grow as a team, there's more work for you to be done as a CEO and founder on the team and on the culture, and okay, who interacts with each other, how do they interact with each other? There can be inter problems arising within each other, that of course when you're just 3 people or 4 people you won't have, but once you're 10 people, 15, imagine once you're 100 people, of course you start having these things, right? So and I mean, I think, I don't know, but I believe the only way to really fight against this is to constantly keep everyone fully aligned on a vision and a mission, right? Because then everyone is always working for the greater good of the company and for the mission that we're trying to achieve. And as long as that is always sort of stuck in the core of it, and then okay, people might have disputes, people might think differently, people might make different decisions, but everyone knows that everyone is always making a decision because they think that's the best decision for this company to move forward. So I think, yes, we're not perfect and it will definitely still happen and arise, but I think that's the only way to sort of go against that.
Makes sense. Since we are getting to the end of our time, I wanted to ask you if you have an advice for our viewers now that you have gone through multiple years of founding, you have gone through multiple foundings now with the second company as a startup, the first company in the scale-up phase. To anybody that's founding a startup or wanting to scale a company, what is something that you've learned that you might have wanted somebody else as an advisor to have told you before?
Yeah, I think the first one to come to mind is really, be honest with yourself, be true to yourself on both a skill set side and also passion side. So if you want to start a company, don't just start a company because you say, hey, I want to start a company because it's cool and I can be, self-employed. But start it because you have a mission, start it because you have a vision of how you see the future. Because the truth is, you're going to have to be 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 9 years doing this. And you need to be sticking into that, even when it's not going great, even when, it's not looking all gravy and everything. So really find something that makes sense to you, that you believe you can stay in for a long time. Because in the end, what you are doing is you're investing your time. So you might not invest money, maybe you even invest money, then it's money and time. But cherish your time and sort of find the right thing for yourself to do. And then enjoy the ride. I mean, not everyone knows everything, and don't feel like you do need to know everything when talking to people. Actually, the more that you feel you don't know everything, the more likely you are to be open to people's opinions. You're going to ask a lot of questions. Asking 1,000 questions is better than thinking you know 1,000 things, because that's how you will get further yourself.
I like that. Asking more questions than making statements is a wonderful way to finish our conversations today. Thank you so much, Fabian.
Cool.
It was an amazing pleasure to have you. I hope to see much more from you, and I wish you the best of luck with the company. Until then,
Thank you so much, Matthias.
thank you so much. And that was Behind the CEO's Door, first edition of the international community. And thank you very much for watching, and we see you next time.